Alright, hello again, AP Lit students. Hopefully, looks like the camera's working, everything's going well. So I'll upload this video to YouTube and I'll also just keep it as a PowerPoint because YouTube was acting weird. So I hope everyone's doing well. Um, some reminders before we get started. If you're taking the AP exam, make sure you are following the College Board. They have a playlist that they keep adding to for AP Literature, and they are preparing, especially as it gets closer to the exam, they're preparing lessons that will directly help you with the one free response question that is the new stay-at-home exam. So make sure you're looking at that. I'm not going to drag everyone through that. I'm not going to make my lessons focus entirely on what's on the AP exam because not everyone's taking the exam. If you are looking at the playlist and doing some of those assignments, please email me if you have questions or if you want me to look over something that you have done to practice. Several of you have done that and have given you some feedback. So remember the AP exam is coming up a little bit less than a month away, so don't forget about it. So this week we're going to talk about existentialism in The Stranger and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. So just a brief review of existentialism, and if you completely forgot, just Google crash course existentialism. It's 9 minutes or something like that. Really good overview. So two things to remember, good faith and bad faith. So existentialists basically believe that there's no definite meaning to be had, that any meaning that we find in the world, it's something that we personally impose on the world. It's not a universal meaning that's ours to discover. It's something that we personally believe in and that we've come up with on our own. And if anyone is trying to tell you that there's a universal meaning, they are wrong or they're lying to you. Now this, again, it's a belief, it's a philosophy. I'm not saying that that you should believe in this. I'm not saying that I believe in this. It's one set of ideas. And the reason I mention this is it does, in some ways, contradict traditional religion, and so I'm not trying to say that this is right and something else is wrong. This is one idea that we're looking at. And we're looking at two authors' takes on this idea. So if you have, from an existentialist point of view, good faith, it means that you realize life has no meaning, and it's up to you to create meaning. And where this becomes challenging is it means that at every single point in your life, you need to be thinking, okay, why am I doing this? Who told me to do it? Is it the right thing to do? And you kind of have to constantly question yourself. So if your job, let's take me for example, if my job is a teacher, I can't just go in every day and say, well, I'm teaching because someone told me to teach, and I'm doing this lesson because someone told me to do the lesson. I have to every single day say, okay, why am I doing this? I have to take attendance every day? Well, hold on, is this a good idea? Like, am I just doing it because someone told me to do it, or is this actually a good idea to take attendance? When you do that for every single decision that you make, it gets very tiring. But the existentialist would say, we're burdened with that freedom. We have to constantly make choices, and we can't kind of shirk that responsibility by letting someone else tell them what to do. Someone of bad faith for an existentialist, kind of ironically, is someone who, in regular terms, might have good faith. It's someone who may choose to follow someone else's teachings. So if you strongly follow a religion, or if you strongly follow someone's philosophy blindly without thinking about it, without considering it, you have bad faith. If anyone last year studied the Transcendentalists a little bit, the Transcendentalists in some ways were similar to the existentialists in that they wanted to go out and make sure they were honestly questioning things and kind of marching to the beat of their own drum and making sure that they were doing things intentionally for the right reason. So in some ways, the Transcendentalists, if you studied them last year, Emerson and Thoreau, they were trying to be good faith existentialists. They didn't want to just follow what everyone else was doing. And one famous example is one of the Transcendentalists did not want to pay taxes, the poll tax. It was being used to support a war that he did not agree with, and he thought that it was everyone's individual responsibility to think about where your money went. So honestly, can you imagine that if every single person in the country refused to pay taxes because we had issues with some of the ways that our taxes were spent? I mean, I think in the long run, maybe it would help to cut down wasteful spending, but can you imagine the burden that that would place on society and on each individual to research where every single dollar was going? So there are benefits, but it's not super practical. So most people, like Ross and Gill in the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, they kind of like being told what to do. when the king summons them, they feel like it's being given a slice of childhood. It's really nice. You're just being told, all you have to do is do what you're told. You don't have to think about things anymore. In some ways, it's kind of like the times before the coronavirus, when we just went to school, someone in the classroom told us what to do and when. The bell would ring, it would tell me when I could stop talking about AP literature and start talking about journalism. Now things are a little bit more jumbled, so I think some of us might be missing that authority, and others might be thriving. So it's kind of a personal preference. So The Stranger and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. They do fit in the camp in some ways of existentialism. So in The Stranger, we keep waiting for Marceau to have some kind of traditional epiphany. We want him to express remorse or fear or realize that he loves Marie, something that a normal protagonist would do, right? They're going to have a change of heart. We're going to end up liking them. Even if they do get executed at the end, we'll be crying for them because now they're a true human being. Ross and Gil are searching for meaning or identity or direction, and we keep hoping like something's going to happen. They're going to realize something about themselves. In the end, Gil does try to stab the player, and we maybe hope or expect something will become of that, but it just kind of falls flat, and there are no answers. So the question is, I had to pause the video because my daughter just ran up here asking if I would like a pretend banana split, and I'm a little disappointed because I would like a real banana split instead. But anyway, the question is, does literature kind of impose meaning in our lives? And by literature, I mean movies, any kind of film, most TV shows, books that you've read, they seem to impose a meaning. Death is meaningful when people die. There's meaning behind it. Do you want to show them the banana split that you brought?
Look.
Wow, thank you. That looks delicious. Thank you.
I got a banana and an ice cream.
Oh, thank you.
I made it just for you.
Anyways, so when we watch movies and film, things seem like they're wrapped up in a neat little bow. Even when something bad happens, it makes sense. But in life, that's not really the way it works. What sense did it make that on March 12th we got a phone call at 5 in the morning that our lives were going to be changed basically for the rest of the school year and possibly beyond that? It doesn't make sense. There was no foreshadowing. There's no real definite lesson to be learned. So life doesn't work the way that film and novels work. So the question is, does art impose meaning on life, and are we looking for things that make sense that's not really there? So your task for this week, I want you to look at these two passages. One is Marceau's epiphany, and you could put epiphany in air quotes if you wanted to. I mean, he does have an epiphany. It is a realization. It's not a traditional one. It's not a typical one. His epiphany is basically that he was right the whole time, that he always thought that there was no meaning in life, and oh wow, there is no meaning in life. And then Guildenstern's attempt at the end, when he finally takes action and finally decides to stab the player, thinking that it will have some kind of meaning, and then it kind of fizzles out. Why did the authors use these passages, and how do the passages relate to the larger meaning of the work as a whole? So you can watch this video, think about it, read the passages, and then spend up to 45 minutes writing your response, but you don't have to count the time that you've spent thinking about it in that 45 minutes, and this should be 45 focused minutes. Share your response via a Google Doc so I can give you feedback, and in the next few slides, I want to walk you quickly through the passages. So the first part of Marceau's epiphany, he's extremely angry, right? He's been sitting in prison, this priest comes to talk to him, and we're expecting something to, something to happen with him, and it's not necessarily what we expect. So he starts screaming at this guy, he's grabbing him, he's enraged, and the language, this sort of joy, this ecstasy of joy and rage, I poured out on him all the thoughts that had been simmering in my brain. It's like almost this hot volcanic liquid, the great figurative language. He uses more figurative language later on. The priest seems so certain, and yet none of his certainties was worth one strand of a woman's hair. So he's saying basically something physical and tangible is worth so much more than these supposed certainties that this priest had. And then so we have more figurative language, and I'm sure you've noticed that The Stranger in general, the novel, very sparse, not a lot of imagery. It's kind of a boring read in terms of style. I mentioned during class that when I was in AP French, we had to read The Stranger in the original French, and the reason that the teacher chose it is it's written so simply that even a struggling AP French student could read and understand what was happening. Even if the existentialism parts of it were difficult, we could physically, literally read the text. So the parts where the figurative language does jump out at you, one of them was the murder scene. The language, it's an assault to the eyes. In my copy, I have almost nothing underlined in terms of what to analyze in the text. But then when that passage jumps out where the sun is assaulting his eyes and things like that, it should jump out at you. And the same thing for this epiphany. So the figurative language is very vivid. Meursault uses a simile here, like a corpse. The priest is living like a corpse. So he's living, but he is more dead than alive. And Meursault says, ironically, it seems as if Meursault's hands are empty, but he's the only one that actually has anything. And the thing that he has is certainty. Meursault, and again, this is his opinion, I'm not saying this is the absolute universal truth of everything, but Meursault believes that the truth and the certainty of the world is that nothing has meaning. And so that's why he himself, awaiting execution, has more knowledge than he believes the priest or anyone else. And he gives lots of examples to make sure we understand how the fact that life is meaningless. I'd pass my life in a certain way, I might have passed it in a different way. If I'd felt like it, I'd acted thus, I hadn't acted otherwise, I'd done X, whereas I had done Y or Z. What did that mean? So he's saying I could have made any choices, and honestly, nothing matters. He repeats, nothing. Nothing had the least importance, and I knew well quite why. He talks about from this dark horizon, so some more figurative imagery, there's a persistent breeze that has been blowing towards him. It's not a violent breeze, it's not a storm, it's not anything like that, it's not attacking him, but it's this persistent breeze that has been slowly coming towards him. And basically what this breeze has been telling him is death is certain. That's really all that there is, and so that's the only certainty we can have. And he mentions things like God, mother's love, choices and things like that. He mentions those all to show how in his mind they are meaningless. He talks about this idea of privilege, and what he's saying is that everyone alive is privileged and everyone who's condemned is dead or realizes that they will die. And so he realizes that now he's basically as good as dead. He's in a prison cell, he's made his choices, and now death has come for him. And basically, in this passage, he does let us know that he's more aware than maybe he initially let on. So he says things like Salamana's wife and Salamana's dog. He understands that the two things shouldn't really be the same, and yet they are. He realizes that Raymond and Celeste are basically not the same level of worthiness, but he's saying it doesn't matter. He's saying that Marie can marry me, she can be kissing someone else, it honestly doesn't matter. And he does admit that he's basically being condemned because he did not weep at his mother's funeral. So he does understand what he's doing, he just doesn't care because he doesn't think it matters. And so this passage here definitely tells us that he's more aware than he lets on. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I want you to look at this passage as well to compare and contrast. This is toward the end, right before Ross and Gil kind of just disappear, and it's not 100% sure what that means when they disappear. Do they die? Do they just move on to something else? It's left open-ended intentionally, and whatever interpretation you decide as the larger meaning of this play, you should weave in their disappearance. How does that disappearance reconcile with that larger meaning? So in the first part, the player talks about how the actors basically die really well. That's their talent. And he says, I extract significance from melodrama, a significance which it does not in fact contain. But occasionally from out of this matter there escapes a thin beam of light that, seen at the right angle, can crack the shell of mortality. And what he's saying there is that literature imposes meaning on us. I talked about this in an earlier slide. Literature imposes meaning on us. Life doesn't actually, thank you, life doesn't actually contain meaning the way literature does, but we like to read literature and impose meaning on it, and it sort of helps us to understand things. And what he means is cracking the shell of mortality. Once in a while we'll read a piece of literature or see a film or something like that, and something resonates with us, and it does give us meaning. What would an existentialist say about that? Is that meaning genuine if it definitely comes from us, if we're not letting someone else tell us without thinking about it? Gil gets very angry and he gets mad at the actors and say that their deaths that they enact are just cheap mechanics, they're cheap melodrama. He thinks it's not believable, right? He thinks that real death is different, and the player insists. So the player here talks about how people are conditioned to expect a certain thing. In Their Eyes Were Watching God, for example, there are many deaths, and all the deaths kind of mean something. They all make sense. They help the main character, Janie, realize something about herself. We have this bizarre situation that the player describes where they got permission to execute someone live on stage. And it was a disaster because the person who was acting and sentenced to be executed kept crying and breaking character, and the audience just didn't buy it. And I mean, think about, why do we go and see movies where all kinds of bad things happen? I know that like special effects, people's heads blowing up and things like that. Why do we watch that? I mean, that's gruesome and disgusting. Why do we have all these rated R, rated PG-13 violence and excitement? But why are we not lining up to watch actual executions? Is there a difference between what literature is training us to accept and real life? And why? So that's a question that the player is trying to get us to consider here. So at the end, Gil says, no, 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 you've got it all wrong. You can't act death. The fact of it is nothing to do with seeing it happen. It's not gasps and blood and falling about. That's not what makes death. It's just a man failing to reappear. That's it. Now you see him, now you don't. It's the only thing that's real. Here 1 minute, gone the next, and never coming back. An exit, unobtrusive and unannounced. A disappearance gathering weight as it goes on until finally it is heavy with death. If anyone has experienced death of a loved one or of someone close to you, um, I mean, Gil is not off track, right? It's more like someone disappearing. You often hear survivors say, you know, I just keep expecting them to walk in the door. I keep turning and expecting them to be there. It's not this thing that makes sense like it does in the movie. So Gil is on the right track. But then what happens is, um, in the very next lines, he thinks he stabbed the player, but he hasn't. And the player enacts this very dramatic death, which we have been trained to see. It's something you'd expect in a movie or a play or a book. And even Gil buys it. And then we realize it's fake. So even Gil has been trained to expect the type of death that he says is a fake death. So the question I want you to answer is, so what? So in both pieces, they do defy our expectations as readers, right? In The Stranger, there's not a whole lot plot-wise that happens. Most of The Stranger, we're just stuck in his head. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I mean, what is the plot? Is there even a plot? If you had to draw a plot chart, it would be very boring. If you were writing it for my creative writing class, I would tell you that you're not going to captivate readers. But it's done intentionally to make us think about why we expect certain things and why this piece is defying it. So when you think about your response, I really want you to continue to think about, what is the larger meaning of each work? What do they want us to think about or question? And a meaning of a work doesn't have to be a statement. It could be a question that they want to pose to us. So take 45 minutes, think about this, then take 45 minutes, go back to the passages, include direct quotes from the passages, but answer that question. How do the authors use these passages to help influence the readers and create meaning? All right, don't forget to turn in any quarter 3 work by Friday so that I can enter that for quarter 3 grades, which will be used to calculate your final grades. Share your documents with me whenever you can, and as always, any questions, just shoot me an email. All right, see you next week.